Sarah Jane's Last Adventure by Oliver M. Goldblatt, read by Callum Thompson. Chapter 1, Unit Report, Extract 1, Top Secret, FTLVN, Track 042. The second Crenoid invasion of Earth was the result of careful planning, and one reason it was so successful. The first invasion had been a part of the natural life cycle of the species. An adult Crenoid would eject its pods into space with the hope that they would land on a suitable biosphere. 2 of these pods reached Antarctica and remained hidden beneath the ice for thousands of years. They would have posed no threat to humanity had not 3 British scientists discovered the first pod some 40 or 50 years ago and, acting from scientific interest, attempted to study it. Soon after, one became infected. They wisely called in Unit, who sent a special envoy, codename the Doctor, with his assistant, Sarah Jane Smith. The Doctor was responsible for the recovery of the second pod and had intended to direct the treatment of the infected scientist. However, an insane British billionaire named Harrison Chase sent 2 of his agents to steal the pods and kill any witnesses. As a result, the scientists, including the first human Crenoid hybrid, were killed, but the Doctor and Sarah Jane Smith survived. The agents returned the second pod to the UK. About a week later, the second pod consumed a man in Chase's employ. He was transformed into a fully grown Crenoid, approximately 40 feet or 12.1 meters tall, and capable of shooting its pods across the globe. Fortunately, Crenoid are vulnerable to fire, and Unit was able to incinerate the creature before the planet was seriously threatened. What was not appreciated at the time was the Crenoid's growing intellectual development or their power of telepathy. Chapter 2. Back in the Attic. Sarah Jane was moving through the house making sure that everything was in order, despite the fact that everything was falling apart. Luke had lost his train ticket to Cambridge. Clyde needed help with his new comic book, although why he thought she could help she didn't know. Sky was late for the airport, and for some reason, Rani was going on and on about some actor named Sacha Dhawan. On top of everything else, she couldn't find Aunt Lavinia's portrait. Then K9 began repeating, "Mistress," over and over and over. Sarah Jane opened her eyes and lifted her head from her pillow. She was on the settee. It was all just a dream. Rani and Sky had made their flight to America to meet Maria and her dad. Clyde was in London working with a publishing house on his comic book. Luke was at university and ready to turn the world upside down with 0-point energy. Aunt Lavinia's portrait stood on the mantelpiece, as always. "Mistress," K9 called from the attic. "K9?" Sarah Jane called, picking herself up and rushing up the stairs. She reached the attic door and pulled it open. K9 stood on the other side, his ear sensors whirring. "Suggest you activate Mr. Smith at once, mistress." His request was surprising, since neither computer cared for the other. For K9 to admit that his rival was needed meant that the situation was serious indeed. "Mr. Smith, I need you," Sarah Jane called. Mr. Smith changed from his disguise as a fireplace into a powerful alien computer, complete with fanfare. However, the fanfare ended abruptly and was replaced by alarms. Mr. Smith's monitor flashed red and displayed what Sarah Jane understood to be Time Lord iconography. "Warning! Warning!" Mr. Smith cried. "Temporal surge event registering over 0.4 on the Bocker scale." "What does that mean?" Sarah Jane asked. "Causality is breaking down, leaving me nothing to analyze," K9 said. "I can confirm that K9 is correct, Sarah Jane," Mr. Smith added. Sarah Jane looked around the room, then out the windows. She half expected to see a hurricane or a spaceship coming up Bannerman Road, but as far as she could tell, nothing was wrong. Even the trees, which had been suffering from blight, appeared healthy. "What's causing it?" Sarah Jane asked. "A time vessel," Mr. Smith replied, "approaching these coordinates." "A TARDIS?" Sarah Jane cried. "Unable to tell," K9 added. "Distortion entering this time zone. Very near here." Sarah Jane, K9, move back, Mr. Smith commanded. The spot where you're standing. K9 moved backward toward Sarah Jane's workstation, while Sarah Jane stepped down toward Mr. Smith. She could hear a timeship fighting to materialize, a TARDIS, a Dalek task force. The doctor had told her they'd achieved time technology, lost it, then redeveloped it into terrible weaponry. Was this her time? She asked herself. At least the children wouldn't be here to see it. Suddenly, it materialized. A blue police box. "Doctor!" Sarah Jane gasped. But it was not the normal wheezing, groaning sound that Sarah Jane had known all these years. It sounded as if space-time were ripping in two, and the noise finally ended in a thunderclap. Even though the flashing light on the top had gone dark, the machine continued to tremble. "Danger!" K9 cried. "Sarah Jane," Mr. Smith said, "take K9 and leave the attic immediately." Before Sarah Jane could react, the doors of the TARDIS opened, and the doctor reached out with both hands to steady himself in the doorway. "Sarah," he said, looking down at her while his TARDIS continued to tremble. "Doctor," she replied. She had never seen this doctor before. He seemed older than even the doctor she had first met, the one the Brigadier said was his third. His hair was grey, and his eyes were piercing, and as for his eyebrows... He looked straight at her and held out his right hand. "Come with me if you want to live," he said, and to Sarah Jane's surprise, in a Scots accent. "Danger, Doctor! Danger!" K9 squealed. "I know, K9, I know," the doctor replied. "Doctor," Mr. Smith began, "I detect that you are at the center of a temporal storm. If a rift should occur, both time and space..." The doctor reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his sonic screwdriver. "Mr. Smith," he said, pointing his device at the machine, "we don't need you." The screwdriver buzzed, and Mr. Smith retreated back into a fireplace. Sarah Jane wanted to run into the TARDIS and fly away with the doctor forever, but something held her back. "Doctor," Sarah Jane began, "why have you turned off Mr. Smith, and why are you quoting the Terminator?" "Force of habit," he said, as he returned the screwdriver to his pocket. The TARDIS began to tremble even more forcefully. "Not the Terminator quote. I can't stand that movie. Nude time travelers indeed. I need Mr. Smith to stay quiet because I know what could happen, and he doesn't." Now Sarah Jane realized that, despite what she wanted to believe, something felt terribly wrong. "Doctor, why don't you step out of the TARDIS and—" "Sarah," the doctor interrupted, "you must come with me. Now." Sarah Jane looked deep into the doctor's eyes and found herself moving toward the TARDIS. The craft began to tremble even more violently as the doctor stepped aside to let her through. "Danger! Doctor! Danger! Mistress!" cried K9 as he moved toward the TARDIS doors. The doctor slammed them shut before K9 could reach them. Sarah Jane turned to the doctor when she realized what he had done. Before she could say anything, the doctor fell against the TARDIS doors. She reached to help him, but he pushed himself away from the doors, ran to the control console, and took off, all the while acting as if Sarah Jane wasn't there. The TARDIS engine screamed with the sound of iron scraping iron. Sarah Jane was nearly thrown to the floor by the acceleration, but she managed to catch herself, straighten up, and walk toward the console. She looked at the doctor, but he was busy with the controls. Too busy, she thought. "Doctor," she asked calmly, "what exactly is going on?" He looked up at her and was about to say something. Then he looked away. Sarah Jane turned away and couldn't help but notice the new TARDIS interior with its wheels-within-wheels design. On a small table was a pair of sunglasses. She picked them up as if to put them on, but put them back instead. After a moment, she turned to the doctor, who still avoided her gaze. The awkward silence reminded her of that terrible row she'd had with Harry Sullivan. Years ago, she'd needed a source for a big story, and although Harry would have been ideal, he had refused to comment, even on deep background. It would have broken security, he'd explained. Sarah Jane had countered that the Brigadier had always trusted her to withhold anything too sensitive, but Harry wouldn't budge. The row escalated, and Sarah Jane had said some things she later regretted. Harry merely turned away, his face unflinching. It had taken her 2 weeks to calm down and realize what an arse she'd been, She'd called Harry to apologize, but his phone was answered by Mr. Benton. "He's gone," Benton had said quietly. Sarah Jane had never told anyone how their friendship had ended, and looking at the doctor now, it seemed that he had that same look on his face. Sarah Jane opened her mouth to try again when the doctor began talking rapidly. "Imagine if the Soviet Union had invaded Great Britain in 1983, and I only found out later. Could I go back in time and prevent it?" Sarah Jane shrugged. "You're a time traveler." "A time traveler with rules," the doctor corrected. "If I'd attempted to reverse something like that," he said, "I would have broken the first law of time." "So, something's happened, yeah?" Sarah Jane asked. "In the future? 5 years from now?" "What happened? Not the Russians?" she asked incredulously. The doctor shook his head. "But just suppose that in 1983, the Soviets had used a time machine to go back and invade in 1953. Now that I could do something about." "How so?" "When someone meddles with time, it's a Time Lord's job to meddle back, to undo as much damage as possible. You'll have noticed that TARDIS is acting strangely." The TARDIS jolted again, forcing the doctor back to the control panel. "Just a bit," Sarah Jane muttered. "That's time distortion," the doctor continued as he frantically worked the controls. "A very good sign that time travel was involved with this invasion." The doctor pulled one last switch and turned to Sarah Jane. "If we can prove that, you and I," he said with a smile, "the world has a chance." "But who was it? Daleks? Cybermen?" "Cybermen with time technology? Never," the doctor mused. "And not the Daleks, but—" Before the doctor could complete this thought, the TARDIS landed with a thud that nearly sent them both to the floor. "Prepare yourself for a shock," the doctor said, after they had pulled themselves upright. He flicked a switch, and the doors opened halfway. "Don't go outside," he ordered. "Just look around first." Sarah Jane cautiously moved toward the doors, more unsure of this doctor than she had ever been of any of his previous incarnations.